Hey folks, welcome to Role of Law. Today I want to talk a little bit more about world building, because for lots of DMs this can be one of the most fun things. Creating your own setting for the players to have fun in, and it's really important to create a fun and engaging setting. So one of the things I want to offer as a tip for this is just don't be afraid to get weird. And what do I mean by that? Well, most settings have kind of conventional designs. There's a lot of very Lord of the Ringsy kind of settings, medieval fantasy. And this is in a lot of ways, for at least for Dungeons and Dragons, kind of the base expectation. But some of the settings that people are most fond of, or at least talk about a lot, are ones that really break the rules in some big ways. So when we look at Dark Sun, for example, Dark Sun deviates from that in all sorts of ways. It's kind of fantasy post-apocalyptic. It involves, sorcerer kings slowly turning into dragons as they destroy everything around them. It's a really interesting, weird setting. Spelljammer is equally kind of weird. But you don't need to make weird the entire focus of your setting. It's something that you can use and inject into a setting, but I think it's something that really needs to be there to at least some degree. Your party in most D&D settings, most D&D campaigns, is probably going to start off in a fairly conventional small town. They're going to be adventurers from Hamletsville or Townsburg or wherever it is. And that's perfectly fine. I'm not trying to, throw stones at this at any means. In fact, that's typically how I start my campaigns. But I always want there to be places out there that are strange and weird and wonderful and wild that players can go and investigate. And in fact, when I have players looking at my maps, I often want them to be going, wait a minute, what's up with this place? Like, that's a strange thing. And to be able to point to some of these places that are unusual. And typically you'll get players, even at early levels, if they can see that those places exist in your setting, they'll get excited. They'll be like, ooh, we have to end up at this place sometime. And now you already have some game plans, right? You're not going to sort of script everything out, but if you know that your players are interested in a particular area that you've built in your world, you can certainly have something that takes them there later on. An adventure hook that's like, hey, we're traveling to that place that you thought was really fascinating. Now, weird can be a bit difficult because we can tend to get sort of into a rut with our expectations, and it can be hard to break out of that. And I find the best way to do this, at least for me, and you may have different approaches that work for you, but it's just to kind of let my brain wander in weird directions. And so as an example, I'm going to talk about a place from my campaign setting, which is the town or city. I'm not really sure sort of how you define it in terms of size differentiations or whatever, but it's the town of Oasis that walks. And how did I come up with this? Well, first of all, I started with the fact that I was building a place in a desert kingdom, and I thought, well, naturally there's going to be towns based around water sources. So really a town based around an oasis kind of is a given. That makes sense. And then I did what I often do, which is I started with a random name generator. And so this one that I was looking at, I think this is the one I used, is at fantasynamegenerators.com. I'll put a link to it in the description below. It's really useful, but yeah, this is not like a product pitch or anything else. This is just sort of how things were going. And so you can click and get a bunch of different things, and I'm pretty sure the one that came up, and I don't remember if it was this one or a different thing, was the Walking Oasis. And then I had a thought that is a thought that often precedes me coming up with something I really like for a campaign setting or for an adventure or whatever. And that thought goes a little like this. Well, that's stupid. And then it didn't stop there, because sometimes you're like, well, that's dumb, and that's it, because there's lots of things that are dumb, especially coming out of a random generator. They will spit out all sorts of things that are garbage. But it stuck in my head, and I went, well, I mean, obviously an oasis can't walk, right? It doesn't have legs. That's silly. But I thought, well, what happens if the oasis, what if this is more of a metaphor? What happens if the oasis moves? And now I'm getting to playing with an interesting idea, because if you're talking about some sort of human settlement or habitation around a water source, if it moves, that's kind of a big deal, right? That's a major event. And so I thought, well, I started, my initial thinking of this was the Oasis sort of creeping along the ground somehow. And I thought, I could do it that way, and absolutely you could. I mean, you'd have to think about what that would look like, in terms of people aren't going to build things right next to the Oasis if it might move into this place that you've built. But I decided that really wasn't sort of what appealed to me. What I came up with next was that the idea of the Oasis moving, but maybe a little more suddenly. And so suddenly this Oasis just dries up in one place and reappears in another. And I thought, that's fun. Like, that leads to some interesting questions. Why is it doing this? But also, how does this affect the people who live there, who are trying to sort of be around this? So I thought, how often does this happen? And I kind of came up with, well, maybe, varying somewhere between 3 months and a couple of years, right? So it's, people don't know exactly when it's going to happen. It's not it happens on this particular date, although you could do that way too, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, this thing is like clockwork. You can set your watch by it. But that's not really how I wanted to go. It's not where my imagination led me to. So I thought, well, so if this thing moves abruptly, without necessarily a lot of warning, well, that's going to have some really interesting fallout in terms of how this town works. I'm thinking people aren't going to be building a lot of permanent structures, because if you're going to go out there and build like a clay building, you might have a great spot for it. It might be right next to the Oasis where people are going to be coming to get water. So you're sitting there selling your, I don't know, whatever trinket you're selling, and you've got the best spot in town. So you want to build a permanent structure. Well, that's not so good if suddenly the Oasis moves and it's maybe 30 miles. That's a problem, right? Because now you just have to leave that all behind. That leads me to the idea that people are going to build stuff, right? People are going to have structures of various sorts. But the idea there that I sort of came to was maybe they're going to be doing this in much more temporary ways, or ways that are designed to pack up and move. And I thought, well, what happens when this stuff packs up and moves? Clearly, that's going to be a bit of a sort of a gold rush scenario, in the sense that you're going to want to get the best real estate. And what used to be really great real estate is now going to be the middle of the desert. So now I'm thinking, okay, everyone's got to pack this up. It becomes a major production as everyone's racing to get to the new site to set things up. That's going to be really interesting. This tells me all sorts of fun things. I'm thinking it's kind of first come, first served. You set up your place and that's it. And the city, or this town, is going to have a different configuration each time. People are going to go there and the streets are going to be different every time you get set up. So just because you went there once doesn't mean you necessarily know where anything else is again. All of this is starting to sound really cool to me. All of this, and this is the point where I start to really get excited about an idea and go, I really like this. Because now I can think of all sorts of fun adventures. Let's say that you've got, the party is chasing after somebody in the middle of this, and suddenly the Oasis is moving and the whole town is getting unpacked. I can start thinking of social issues. If you want to move an entire sort of structure, even taken down, and assuming that a lot of it is going to be canvas and wood poles and so forth, there's still going to be some economic disparities there, because if you can afford a lot of camels to move this stuff, you've got a great chance of being there first for the next, setup. But let's say you're poor and you have to do this on foot. That might be a lot more difficult. And in fact, it might be impossible if you're talking about trying to move your house on foot. So then I start thinking, how are people going to resolve that? Well, for starters, the whole thing of the rich getting there first and having the best setups, probably isn't something that is going to get fixed in most societies. A lot of societies tend to think of that as a feature rather than a bug. So now I've got some inequality and some tension built into my system, because now this is a reason why people might be having fights or struggles over this stuff. This is an important, scarce resource. But typically there's also charity. People tend to want to do good, both because they are themselves people who think that they think of themselves as good people. I think there is a lot of good out there, but also you're going to have people who want to be charitable so that they can be seen to be charitable. And in a lot of societies, we develop sort of practices and habits that communicate to the rest of the world that we are good people. And so when you see this, I imagine that like the rich hustle out there to get the best spots, but then they also want to show their charity and their largesse, and they probably do that in part by going and helping some other people to make it out there. And that's, so now I've established a cultural norm here that the people think that it's expected that if you can, go help some other people out, don't leave people behind, but they're still going to get theirs first, right? So now I've got this sort of cultural dynamism. Because this place is going to be difficult to navigate at various times, with with people basically building streets not based on a plan, but based on who got there first and that kind of thing. I'm also imagining that there's going to be a lot of local guides, and that those local guides might be really necessary. If you're navigating this city that is sort of tent structures that are constructed in haste with different, the roads between them might be pretty narrow, they might be really winding, and they might be confusing. So the locals probably figure this out pretty quickly, but if you're a visitor to this town, it's probably pretty miserable to find your way around. You might need to hire somebody who'd say, let me guide you along, and take some money. And this also gives me an opportunity to inject an NPC into the party group, which I can use for various purposes. Maybe he's comic relief. This guide is hilarious. Or maybe this guide is acting against the party in some way. He's actually a spy for their rivals. Or maybe he's some surprisingly helpful person, he or she. Whatever it is, this gives me something that I can do to build on this. So I'm really at this point liking this idea. It's a great sort of concept, and you can keep building on it. This is, I think, where good ideas come from. But all of it comes from this town that is strange and unusual. And we can do this in all sorts of ways. There's all sorts of places where, if you're making a map and if you use any sort of random generation, there's probably going to be some things that end up being a little janky. A place where, a desert suddenly borders onto a jungle or a lush forest. You might say, well, what's the deal with that? You can just throw in things that are just outright strange and then build from there. What happens if you have a river in your campaign setting that flows backwards? It goes from the ocean up to the mountains. Now we can start playing with all sorts of ideas with that, right? What does that mean for people? Does that mean that it's a saltwater river? That's curious. Where does that water go? What do people do with this? All of these are really interesting ways to build a setting, and it's really fun when you start seeing your players thinking, we have to go visit that town. And when they get there, when they start engaging with things that are different and unexpected, my sort of campaign setting includes a lot of these things. I try to put in a bunch of them. You don't want to necessarily get to the place where weird is commonplace. Now you can do that. If you're looking at Planescape, weird is kind of the default expectation and everything is strange. That works just fine. But for many people, and this is sort of my setting design, I want it to be a sort of ordinary setting in base expectations, with places that get more unusual as you get to them, and these are places that stand out as weird. as opposed to part of the overall weird kind of background. So I love to include these places. I've got places like a town that where the people who live there, when they die, they come back as undead and keep being townspeople. So kind of breaking the usual rule, because most undead like to just eat the living, but they just kind of do town things. That's strange, but it also creates an interesting setting where stuff can happen. I might set up a particular kingdom that is super authoritarian. There is one in my setting. By the same token, there's another setting that goes the other way, where people are very much in favor of liberty, and what does that look like in a D&D or fantasy setting. So I really think that this is important. It's a great way to build a campaign setting, and this isn't just something that applies to Dungeons and Dragons or fantasy games. In my Stars Without Number setting, there's all sorts of places, which include pretty ordinary towns where you can stop, or ordinary planets where you just stop off, you do business, whatever else, but also places like an entire world that is full of hostile plant life that wants to eat people. I've got a world with dinosaurs, because dinosaurs are cool. I've got, all of these things that I put out there into the campaign setting. My Stars Without Number campaign setting includes a planet where there are sound-sensitive landmines over most of the planet, which requires people to be very, very cautious about how they deal with that in those areas. Oh, and did I mention that those landmines don't necessarily just kill you? They turn you into a kind of cyber zombie? Because, hey, you gotta do, you gotta lean into some weird sometimes. So I hope that this has been useful, both as an example of kind of the thought process of let's weird up my campaign setting a little bit, but also why you might do this and how it can function in a setting. This is something that creates a place that I think has a lot of potential for adventure. There's just so many things. And one other sort of cautionary note here is that you don't necessarily have to explain everything. It's okay to leave mysteries. When we talk about Oasis that walks, why does it move? Right? Well, I don't know. I've actually got a bunch of ideas for that, and this can in some ways be, a Schrodinger's cat kind of situation, where if it becomes relevant, I can kind of collapse that waveform down and say, this is why. But for right now, I don't need to have an answer to that. And in fact, the campaign setting, people may not know the answer to that. Mysteries are themselves fun. But if the players really want to solve this in some fashion, I can make an entire adventure or an entire adventure arc around figuring this out. And there's all sorts of possibilities. Maybe there's some sort of water elemental creature deep below the surface that moves for some reason. Maybe there's some sort of sandworm down there that, as it moves, sometimes disrupts the path of the water flow, and disrupts the groundwater. Maybe it's some sort of magical curse. Maybe it has to do with, maybe all sorts of possibilities, right? I could write any kind of thing as to what explains this, but for right now, it works just fine as a mystery, and in some ways is more interesting as a mysterious thing. So don't be afraid to leave the mystery in. There are some places in my setting that are weird that I have an answer for, and others that I deliberately don't. And that's okay. All right. Thank you guys for joining me. I really hope you found this to be interesting and to be useful for your settings. Please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to see more of this, and see you next time.